center, an eccentric center for our activity as intercultural philosophers with a very rich history of the encounter between East and West, of course being an origin really for Western infiltration in the modern period, starting late 16th century, Matteo Ricci. All of that history is really concentrated here in Macau, with all the ambivalences that entails. There's also the presence, the overwhelming presence all around us of the casino industry, which I'm sure you could not help but notice, which seems in many ways to be the contrary of what we're trying to do here, although philosophy is a gamble in its own way as well. And when you think about it historically, philosophy did not really originate in Athens, in the Agora, or in the heartland. It originated on the rim of the Greek world, Magna Graecia, in Asia Minor, Miletus, Ephesus. On the other side with Agrigento, that's Empedocles, or Crotone is Pythagoras' hometown, Elea, for Parmenides. Those were all commercial centers, seaports, and there is some sort of a symbiosis, I think, between philosophical reflection, original philosophical reflection, really at the origins of this tradition on one side of the world anyway, and the ferment of commerce all around us. That too is supporting us here. Let that be an acknowledgement. So, in some way, I think also we can get a perspective on philosophy by starting from a point outside the center. You can see things as a whole, and much of what we'll be talking about, I'm guessing, will have to do with how to see whole. Now, I think I will say just a word of introduction for our first session as well, comprising myself, Roger Ames, Karl-Heinz Paul. Both Karl-Heinz and I believe, are addressing Roger's work, which I see as being, in many ways, the fundamental and powerful and persistent statement on the question that we're here to discuss, of transcendence and immanence. I actually work more directly from François Julien in the work that I've been doing over the 2 years and 3 months now that I've been here in Macau. But in many ways I see the same sorts of issues arising in Roger Ames's work, and I'm turning more and more to some kind of a dialogue with him. That's one reason why I was so eager to bring him here to continue the kind of construction of selves through mutual exchange, interaction, constructing our relational selves together. This is his program, which he brings out of the Confucian classical tradition in compelling ways. I want to start off with a somewhat outrageous suggestion that Roger Ames is a philosophical prophet. I see him as a philosophical prophet. I say that at the risk probably of horrifying him. In the great tradition of Nietzsche, Emerson, revealing to us the enchantedness of quotidian existence, how the everyday is inspirational. These are the kinds of lessons that I have been gathering from other traditions. He's working from this great Confucian tradition. I have been inculcated through my studies with another prophetic tradition. Some of you know that Dante is really my own focus as professional scholar. Dante, Milton, Blake. These are prophets in the tradition more of transcendence. Now, My job then is to try to bring together my various families, right? This intellectual household that I have, this is part of my baggage. They have made me what I am and have constituted my thinking. Now I have to bring that into dialogue with a kind of radical thinking of transcendence, which is coming from these Chinese sources in François Julien, in Roger Ames. What's especially compelling about the Confucianism of Ames, I don't know if it's Hawaiian or Bostonian Confucianism, is its concreteness. Starting really with those basic relationships that we all do start with in our family, and working out from there. What could be more immediate, evident, concrete, familiar, the perfect starting point? Why should philosophy go anywhere else? Or it needs to remain obviously connected with that basic experience. I want to try to suggest that the apophatic, the unsayable, is also about relationships, fundamentally. More fundamentally than it is about God, the One. It is also always already, about our relationships and embodied relationships. We have works coming out now, The Apophatic Body, which, in fact, there's a citation from that now that I think Catherine Keller, in some of the work that I'll be passing over. I'm not going to read all of this to you, obviously. So I think that if we take the concepts coming out of even transcendental types of traditions in their historical cultural contexts, that they too are powerfully motivated. Even these concepts of God and the One, do we want to just throw them out? Or do we have to understand them in a way, and perhaps along with that, the Tao? How are we going to understand Tao and Tian in ways that are obviously, that have everything to do with our relationships, but perhaps they introduce something that is not articulable in any objective terms. And in many ways, Ames is a critic of that kind of objectivism, a powerful critic in thinking. So these are some of the convergences that I just want to suggest here up front. With that, then, I will begin by suggesting that the question of immanence versus transcendence is among the most controversial and has in many ways become the key issue in comparative or intercultural philosophy today. It's really on this question that the most authoritative interpreters find themselves in sharp and seemingly irresolvable disagreement, right? Die Geister gehen auseinander, as German says. Minds simply divide. Something more is at issue here than just accurate reading, sober reflection, and level judgment. Our most basic decisions concerning who we are, what it is to think, and the fundamentals of our worldviews are at stake. My aim will be to show that when transcendence is reinterpreted apophatically, as I think it implicitly is by those who defend it in its application to Chinese thought, it stands no longer in opposition to immanence. I contend, in fact, that apophatic transcendence recuperates the essential insights also of those advocating immanence as an indispensable key to interpreting Chinese thought. Either apophatic transcendence or apophatic immanence captures what both apparently antagonistic parties are trying to express as fundamental and distinctive about Chinese thinking, even while coming at it from different angles and opposing directions. Although both groups are trying to individuate what is specific and perhaps in some ways unique about Chinese thinking, an apophatic way of understanding it brings this type of insight into close correlation with some of the deepest and most elusive strands of thinking that have persistently asserted themselves also in the West, often by indirect means, since antiquity. The concepts of transcendence and immanence accordingly lend themselves to serving as axes for cross-cultural comparisons. Now, what Julien means by immanence is not easy to grasp or encompass with a concept, but he explains it to us, among other places, in his interpretation of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, the Chinese classic par excellence. This work on Julien's reading in his Figures de l'Immanence, its Figures of Immanence, is not in its core a book in the usual sense, for it is constituted not by words, but by diagrams, solid or broken-like segments stacked on top of one another to form trigrams, which are then combined by pairs into hexagrams. This, in order not to mess up the technology which is set now for the talks that are coming, you know what the I Ching looks like. Here are these 64 hexagrams. That's just an emblematic image for us. As I talk following Julien a little bit about this as an emblem of the immanence that is characteristic of Chinese tradition from its origins. The system of combinations of broken and unbroken lines is not a language nor even a code bearing a discernible sense or meaning. Yet it does somehow correspond to the world in its incalculably complex dynamic as deriving entirely from the interaction between two simple alternatives or poles, yin and yang, earth and heaven, the unbroken and the broken. What is the nature of this correlation? Julien contrasts it with myth. Right? Myth is a history, mythos, literally a story in Greek. It's determined by a beginning and an end. A myth aims then to define the overall purpose and purport of things. From creation, Genesis, to consummation, apocalypse. What Chinese thought, by contrast, aims to represent, starting right from this foundational divination text, is rather the idea of transition or transformation without beginning or end. The simple play of opposites, broken, unbroken, and their transforms across the 64 combinatorial possibilities of the hexagrams, made up in total of 384 lines, constitutes a system for describing the ongoing changes in which nature consists. It does not have a sense or meaning, as myth does, but rather embodies a mechanism for producing unlimited transformation beyond all bounds of sense. Such is the transformation that is effectively produced by nature in its endlessly continuing alternations and in its unceasing cycles of life and death. The hexagrams embody, in an abstract schema, the alternative combinations of yin and yang that result in all the complex changes of phenomena throughout the universe. The I Ching maps the coordinates of the infinitely complex process of change that is uninterruptedly underway in all natural occurrences by the working of simple polarities, various combinations of the continuous or the discontinuous, applied recursively in an infinitely complex rendering of the same simple elements. In effect, just the digital 1 and 0. This original classic equips Chinese thought with a very different way of adhering to the nature of things than what we find in the West. Right? Not by attributing a purpose or a static image of origin or end goal, which imposes a sense on the whole process, but entering into the dynamic play of the world, shifting as it shifts and transits between these poles, the phases of distal and actually diastole, I think would be the term, and systole. That we're able, in this way, to live in correspondence with the way things really are, right? Such as they are, zheran, which is one crucial way of saying nature in Chinese. The trigrams of the Book of Changes, taken as such, without the accumulated interpretations of the ages, do not express a meaning or sense. They're not like ideograms or pictograms, this is still Julien's reading, that are supposed to refer by resemblance to objects in the world, and they do not constitute any meaning-bearing code or language. Their constitutive traces are not exactly just hidden things, but they are not quite meaningful signs either. They are ambiguously intermediate between the orders of logical form and of natural things. So, the consequence here is that China is without a founding epic, it's without a divine revelation, without a myth of beginnings. It's this system of diagrams consisting in simple traces that constitute, that that constitute life in the universe. Now, I think we can see how this is a powerful way of relating to the changes, the unlimited, infinitely complex changes with which we are constantly involved. Just the weather, for example, temperature, pressure, precipitation, wind factor, they're all constitutive of weather as one exemplary system of change. All reality proceeds only from such complex interactions of these poles, right? Hotter, colder, drier, wetter. The complexity, however, is further multiplied by the fact that there are innumerable systems of determination simultaneously operating in any given situation. Since there is no overarching system envisaged as enclosing all the others, what emerges from their interaction is indeterminate, or even the indeterminate, l'indéterminé. As in nature, so in the I Ching, the interplay of these different grids superimposed on one another is responsible for the constant improvisation of what Julien then calls l'immanence. The diagram, unlike the myth, is the mark of a transformation rather than of the story or drama. It's dealing with factors rather than actors. It's indicative of a tendency, even perhaps an inexorable trend, for example, the body towards aging and death, instead of being an etiological explanation of in terms of causes. It's also used for purposes of detection and divination and avoids resorting to the invention of a fiction. It adheres to and imminently corresponds with the continual transformation of all reality rather than imposing this transcendent sense. Now, what I want to suggest is that this immanence, without foundation, without beginning or end, that this description, this situation, can also be a figure of transcendence that metamorphoses into a way of relation to absolute otherness. That is, philosophies of transcendence are thinking the infinite possibilities. Now, the advantage as a thinker of immanence like Julien sees in this kind of a mechanism is that it does not posit the other as existing separately and outside of the process. It evolves from within, the process evolves from within, even the others evolve from within by an internal self unfolding. However, I think that for this process really to be free and unlimited and unconstricted, as I think the Chinese sources are suggesting, it cannot refuse unlimited relation to all others, and even to its own negation, to what it cannot define or encompass in any words or formulas, as identical or as itself. Otherwise, immanence would become a reduction of all to sterile self-identity. And of course, that's not what thinkers of immanence want to see in this Chinese source text and the others that are analogous to it. It's a source of infinite fecundity. But I think that infinite fecundity does require some sort of an unlimited relation to otherness. Now, a simple what I'm referring here is to some thinkers. Let me give some exemplary thinkers of transcendence that I think can also think fundamentally the same sort of process, and that we need to think the sorts of processes, these really open-ended processes that are placed before us by the source texts in the classical Chinese tradition. Rosenzweig, even from Plato to Rosenzweig and Levinas, the thinking of transcendence likewise